I would like to welcome you to the panel discussion that will provide a multidimensional view of the school to work transition of young people with disabilities, specifically highlighting opportunities for policy and practice. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our three panelists for the session. Dr. Arif Jetha is a scientist at the Institute for Work and Health. His research aims at understanding how the future of work will impact the employment of people living with disabling conditions and other vulnerable groups. He is specifically interested in understanding early labor market experiences of youth and young adults with disabilities and their impact on key work and health transitions across life. Our second panelist is Roxana Jahani Aval, who is the second-year law student at the University of Windsor in the single Juris doctorate program, and is currently entering the school to work transition stage of her education. Roxana attended York University and received 2 Bachelor of Arts degrees in Psychology and Human Rights and Equity Studies, where she concentrated on disability rights and legal institutions. Roxana is the chairperson of the Council of Canadians with Disabilities and the past chair of the National Educational Association of Disabled Students. Our third panelist, Cailen Elliott, is a national program manager at the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, and she leads the Youth the Future programs operating in multiple locations in Ontario, including Brampton, Mississauga, Scarborough, and Oshawa, as well as in Quebec and the Atlantic provinces. She has a strong interest in increasing disability confidence in employers across Canada, intersectional service delivery, and in creating positive results for ambitious young job seekers living with disabilities. We will begin the panel presentation with Arif, who will provide a research snapshot on the school to work transition.
Thank you so much, Pinder. As Pinder mentioned, the purpose of my talk is to just provide like a brief understanding of what we currently know about the school to work transition and some of the data to set the scene for the subsequent presentations. So let's start off by defining what we mean when we say the school to work transition. So we know the school to work transition is a critical phase within a person's life where they make multiple vocational transitions in order to leave educational roles, either high school or post-secondary school, with the intention of obtaining employment and advancing within their careers. And so this could involve like taking steps to prepare to enter the labor market, actually entering the labor market, and then taking steps or making changes to sustain or move up within your place of employment. And so not surprising, the experiences a young person has during this period can shape their long-term career trajectory, with several studies talking about a scarring effect. And that means that those who face challenges early on with their employment are more likely to face difficulties remaining employed. They're more likely to report productivity losses and underemployment at the later phases of the working life course. So clearly this period is really important for a person's career development, and it really sets the tone for their working life. So recent data from Statistics Canada suggests that about 2 million youth and young adults are currently living with some level of disabling health conditions. And what's more, young people who do have a disability are less likely to be employed when compared to those without a disability. And data from Statistics Canada shows that young adults with more severe disabilities are more likely to face barriers to employment when compared to their peers who are not living with a disabling condition. So clearly just having a disabling health condition impacts one's ability to participate in the workforce. And also kind of concerning statistics from, again, Statistics Canada, it really paints a dire picture for young people with disabilities. And it's estimated that close to 110,000 young people in Canada with disabilities report not being in education or employment, or what others refer to as NEET. And NEET is a marker for economic exclusion. And I think what's really concerning here is that of that 110,000 group of young people, over 3/4 of those report either being able to work or really wanting to work. So clearly there's a pretty big proportion of those who are excluded from the labor market who want to enter and want to participate. And clearly there's environmental as well as personal barriers that might be impacting young people with disabilities, as well as a lack of support as they enter the labor market. And again, this might contribute to the exclusion that we're seeing. And so it's not just getting into the labor market that tends to be problematic, and research shows that research that we've conducted as well as others have shown that young people with disabilities who are able to find work are more likely to face challenges within their places of employment when compared to their peers not living with a disability. And young adults with disabilities are more likely to report productivity losses at work, including presenteeism or missing work as a result of their disabling health condition, which is what we refer to as absenteeism. They are more likely to report being denied a promotion or a career advancement opportunity at work. They're less likely to earn the same levels of income as those without disabling health conditions. They report being allocated fewer job responsibilities when compared to those without disabling health conditions. And they tend to report difficulties talking about their needs at work and requesting accommodations, and that can really impact their ability to access the types of supports that are most needed. And so in addition to this, we know that diverse workplace supports like job accommodations, health benefits, workplace supports are critical to addressing some of these issues or activity limitations that young people with disabilities might face to employment participation restrictions. But I think what's unique to this group is that being at the early career stage poses specific challenges for requesting and receiving supports at work from an employer. And so in a recent published survey, we asked young people with disabilities about their barriers to accessing workplace supports. And some of the most frequently described barriers to accessing help or assistance at work included difficulties with communicating and disclosing need, the perceived cost of accommodation. So thinking that if they ask for support, it might be too expensive for an employer when we know that that might not be correct. Feeling like work tasks can't be accommodated, which again, we know that a lot of work tasks with creativity can be adapted, and attitudinal issues held by others in the workplace. So fear that if you do talk about your needs, that you'll be discriminated against, or someone might react with a negative reaction. So indeed, we need to consider ways in which we can improve aspects of the work environment so that they address the concerns of young people with disabilities during this critical career phase. And so just lastly, I wanted to present some findings from a systematic review that we completed last year. Here we wanted to know about work-focused interventions that support the school-to-work transition of young people with disabilities. So we weren't concerned about some of the clinical or rehab interventions. What we really wanted to know is what work-focused interventions are most effective in supporting the employment of young adults living with different disabling health conditions, and do the effectiveness of those conditions differ for young people living with different types of disabling health conditions. And so for those who might be unaware, a systematic review is a methodology that aims to identify research, published research, and appraise the quality of the research. So the goal is to identify like the highest quality research and then synthesize findings so that you can produce programmatic and practice recommendations. And so in addressing the first research question, we obtained a high level of evidence for tailored supported employment interventions to facilitate entry into competitive employment or into any type of employment. And so for those who are unaware, so a supported employment intervention includes an educational training component coupled with a job placement, as well as potentially work integrated learning opportunities. The findings from the systematic review in addressing the second question also aim to understand, does the effectiveness of work-focused policies and programs that we did identify vary for people living with different disabling health conditions? And here, what we found was there was some moderate levels of evidence for the effectiveness of supported employment interventions for young adults living with mental health conditions, as well as those with an intellectual or learning disability. So clearly this effectiveness has some like specific benefits for certain groups of young people living with different disabling health conditions. But I think there's some gaps to note that we've highlighted in the research. First, we really know very little about the strategies that support young people in sustaining employment and helping them advance within their careers. As you note in the slide, a lot of the interventions are really focused towards getting young people into the labor market, whereas what are the experiences following that period in terms of moving up within their places of employment. We also don't know about the effectiveness of these interventions within a changing work environment. We know that the labor market is changing at a rapid rate. The COVID-19 pandemic is an example a shock to the system that really created new working conditions. And we don't know how well these interventions layer onto this new way of work. So I think this highlights some critical research gaps that we need to explore a little bit more. And so I'm going to leave you there, but I also want to just highlight my contact information. If anyone wants to reach out and talk more about some of the science on this topic, I'd be happy to chat with any of you. So I'm going to hand it over to Pinder again, who will introduce the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Arif. Your research that you've provided certainly supports the many stories that we've heard as service providers on the multiple challenges that young people with disabilities face when they're trying to connect to the labor market. So thank you. Next, we have Roxana, who will be speaking to the school to work transition from her lived experience as a law student with a disability, but also the general experience of attempting to find work and transition into a career as a student with a disability. Roxana?
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm excited to speak about this in particular because of how important the work is to me. So I just want to start off by kind of reiterating what was discussed a little earlier. So I am a second-year law student, so I'm actually in the phase of transitioning from my law degree into work. And that's going to be done through the OCI process, so the on-campus interviews that's done across the country. So this is a fairly standardized process. It really does speak to the Bay Street firms and to, well, particularly in Toronto where I am, and also government work. So this is the process in which students will put their resumes in, have job searches, etc., and then go through that formal process. And I think the first thing I want to say specifically about that process is that it's very stressful. I think that students with disabilities in particular face a bigger challenge in that process because of the accessibility needs that we have. And in particular for students with disabilities, it's a little bit more of a stressful process because students with disabilities do require accommodations at times. And unfortunately, schools, particularly law schools in Ontario, are not especially equipped to provide such accommodations for the interview process itself. And that can become very, very stressful for students who face especially episodic disabilities and invisible illnesses. And it provides a harder environment to look for work in that way. So that's kind of like the first point I really wanted to highlight there, is that it is a stressful environment. In addition, there's a lot of competition in between finding work for students with disabilities who are in law and able-bodied students who are in law. And we see a lot of comparison done just within the student body in itself, where students will discuss what kind of opportunities they were given versus others. And it does provide, again, a stressful environment for students with disabilities to feel like they're falling behind. So I think my biggest concern around that, and even in the process right now, is how that balance is being struck. Because we see in the accommodation process in post-secondary that the whole point of accommodations is to bring students with disabilities back to a level playing field with other students. And if that's not being done in the employment process, then, I mean, in my mind, was it ever done through post-secondary, if that's the case? If that opportunity is not actually done when it comes down to finding work in quote unquote competition with other students. So that's the process that I'm going through right now, where that's like my thought process around it. And I see this discussion quite a bit within law schools, and even last year when I was in first year and kind of seeing upper years go through that. And the same thing happens in recruitment process for articling. And that's with third year students. And if, for example, especially with COVID going on, a student doesn't receive or get called back to the original firm or government position that they were in for their 2L summer, then they're having to go through that OCI process again in third year for the articling requirement. And to be clear, without the articling requirement, the licensing, they become licensing issues with the Law Society. So it is a requirement for students, if they want to practice, that they have to go through that articling process in some form. So I think that's a big piece for me. And then I also kind of wanted to touch on what it would have been like if, for example, I didn't go to law school and I decided to look for work coming out of my bachelor degrees, and what that process would entail. And so I see a lot of students actually doing that whole process at this point with their bachelor degrees, and it's not easy. So students with disabilities, again, are often faced with having to disclose their disability right off the bat. And a lot of the time that will be done in the application process or in the interview process by requiring accommodations. And to be fair, there's still a very stigmatized lens around disability in employment. And in trying to disclose accommodations, you're essentially also disclosing that you have a disability. And if, for example, an employer, and you never know, if they decide to go another way with that decision, you never know what that kind of decision entailed, if it did entail that disability piece, and if that kind of quote unquote discrimination is being done there, what that looks like. So that again is a very stressful piece of all of this. So I think I'm highlighting a little bit of the negatives here, but there also are a lot of positives. And one of the biggest positives is that students with disabilities who actually do a lot of work in disability, let's say disability rights or psychology around disability or anything like any of those kinds of areas, they'll actually have a great ability to go and find work as long as the positions are available. So some organizations and positions actually look for students or people with disabilities to fill those vacancies, and not in a tokenization sort of way, but actually to bring that perspective into those roles because of how important they are. So I know with COVID it's a little bit different. That kind of line between whether the positions are there or if they're not at this point is a little up in the air right now. But for the most part, I've been seeing a lot of students who are looking for work in disability or disability related areas, or even social science areas, that it's more prevalent now to find work in disability than it was, let's say, 10 years ago, or being a student with disability than it was, let's say, 10 years ago. So I think overall, just for the process itself, it is stressful, but there are still positives around it. And even that being said, just because the process itself is stressful doesn't mean the outcome isn't positive. So I do see a lot of students with disabilities, especially in law, that go into the workplace and do disclose that they have a disability and do require accommodations, and end up getting great jobs and getting the same jobs that other students would as well. And I would say, and this is kind of told to us a lot in law school, is that don't worry, you're gonna get work. So that's a good thing. That's a really good thing. And that makes me feel a lot more confident walking into this process, that there are competent and accessible people to go to in the law schools, and also within career centers within post-secondary, and really seeking out those individuals is important. And then also seeking out mentors if you have them, and kind of talking about how they went through that process within that line of work and into getting work in their careers. So that's my big take on that. And I think if I were to just provide, let's say, a recommendation right off the bat, or a thought process around how to move forward, especially in law, is having either the Law Society of a specific province or territory, or having the Law Society of Canada kind of put a policy together on what it means to go through that OCI on-campus interview process in both 2L and 3L for our summer position and articling, and how they would be able to identify helping students with disabilities, or not discriminating against students with disabilities, and actually allowing them to bring their knowledge to the table without having that fear of accessibility needs having to be disclosed either too early, or having to disclose they have a disability right off the bat, because some students, in all honesty, don't feel comfortable doing that. as disability is a very personal thing to many. So I think that's my biggest piece, just having some sort of policy available for especially career centers to access when students are looking for those accommodations, and really looking to solidify that school to work transition. So thank you. And contact information for me, I think will be provided, but if not, it's just roxana.jahani.aval@needs, neads.ca. Pretty much out there. So if you want to Google my name, and you can probably find my email as well, or any other contact information you'd like. So thank you, and back to you, Pinder.
Thank you, Roxana, for your very impactful insight on your journey as a student with a disability and some of the challenges that you have personally faced. I love that you stressed that even though the process is sometimes stressful, the positive outcome that comes out of it is worth that stressful process. Finally, we have Cailen, who will provide an overview on the challenges and opportunities in employment service provision. Cailen?
Thank you very much, Pinder. So my name is Cailen Elliott. I'm the National Manager, as was mentioned earlier, of CCRW's Youth Programming, the Youth the Future program. I'm here also with Pinder DaSilva, who is our moderator. So she's the Senior Director of Programs and Services at the Ability Center in Whitby, but you'll be hearing from me as she is our moderator. So Pinder's work at the Ability Center develops programs and services to enhance health and well-being, social inclusion, and economic participation for community members of all ages and abilities. Some of you may know that CCRW offers a number of employment service programs, and our youth program does focus on job seekers with disabilities who are 30 years of age and younger, and many are transitioning just out of school or have been out of school for the past couple of years. So a little bit about our program. So we do offer pre-employment training across 4 cities in Ontario, in Montreal, and the Maritimes provinces. I'm proud to share that our Montreal site serves exclusively young women identified job seekers with disabilities, and that our Montreal and Moncton programs serve youth in both of Canada's official languages. CCRW and the Ability Center create programming importantly from a strengths-based approach with participants, focusing on activities that are engaging and inclusive rather than lecture-based, for example. Rather than imposing a rubric from the start, we first start by asking, what do you need to be successful, and building from there, really listening through the job seeker's time with us. So I'm going to share some of our perspectives, as well as hopefully provide some pragmatic suggestions that have either worked for us or that we can recommend for moving forward. And at the end, there is a slide of resource links that we hope you'll find helpful. So transitions from school to work is a challenging journey for all job seekers, and you can remember even for yourselves when you've left school and you're looking for work for the first time or even the nth time. And job seekers with disabilities who are transitioning from school to work may experience additional barriers, and these barriers are compounded when they live at intersecting identities such as race, gender, 2S, LGBTQIA, indigeneity, and so on. So it's critical to remember to meet youth where they're at and to be sensitive to these barriers as part of individualized approaches to service delivery and in the hiring process as well. So it's important to mention that the majority of the job seekers so the program participants come to us having tried to find work either on their own or with the support of other employment agencies or recruiters or other service providers who may specialize in youth with barriers to employment in general, but not disabilities specifically. There are many youth who do identify as having disabilities or living with disabilities and succeed in those programs because the level of support provided by those service providers was sufficient, which is great. And the youth who seek out the Youth the Future program do require a little bit more support and added layers of intervention in their transition to the workforce. So it's critical to mention here as well that while yes, Many youth come to programs like Youth of Future in Need of Support, accommodations exploration, skills training in job searching, whether or not they learned it or remember in school, or remember it from school, which is usually not. There is an equal emphasis on employer awareness here and confidence building for employers in disability. So many youth in the program would be exceptional employees, and I want to emphasize that in order for a successful transition for the workforce, especially directly from school to work, an employment relationship rather than just an agreement as in an exchange of labor for pay must really be cultivated by all. Youth who have previous work experience, for example, from a high school, co-op or internship, or even a really engaged volunteer placement, we find on average have a more successful experience in our pre-employment program and in their integration to the labor market compared to youth who come to us without a resume in hand or any work experience or socially integrated experience whatsoever. I can highlight that there are some programs at the college level, such as the CICE program at Humber College in Ontario. It furthers even more the positive and professional work habits and preparation for employment in today's labor market. So experiential learning is so critical to success. Just having a couple of handouts and spending a few days on pre-employment training for the youth that we serve isn't sufficient. The youth really need to be living it and practicing in a real time so that they feel comfortable with what they're doing. The more consistent and sustained training and opportunities such as hands-on workshops and on-the-job practice to learn that job seekers can have, it will make the transition from school to work that much more smoothly. This is a great opportunity for me to mention the Disabilities Mentoring Day through Dolphin Digital. So this is a nationwide initiative that's been running for some time now, pairing job seekers with disabilities with professional mentors in the sectors that they're interested to work in. So while this is short-term in nature, so ideally longer term is best for skills retention and really developing those good professional work habits. This is a really great opportunity for youth to get a taste in real time, living it in the jobs or the sectors that they might be interested to work in with professionals who are working in that field or in that sector. Sometimes employment offers come out of those mentorships, but the point is for the experience. A lot of the times the youth will come to programs like Youth of Future and have no idea what type of work that they would want to be looking for, which is fine. That's part of the process. But having an idea of this is sort of an area that I want to go in, and I know that I'm interested in this because I've done it, and I know that I have skill sets in this area, and I know that I need to develop in these areas. It makes the job search that much more stressful. And I want to, Roxana mentioned the stress, and that is definitely a real factor, and having some previous experience and that knowing is really important for young job seekers as they transition to the workforce. So as I mentioned before, positive and engaged partnerships with employers is another critical factor for success. So without engaged or participatory approaches on behalf of the employer, the efforts of employment service provider with the job seeker can fall what occurs to be really one-sided, and it's not a great experience for the employer either. I can highlight that a job coach or someone who will be working directly with the job seeker for a short-term basis on the jobs for them to learn their skills in a more fulsome manner can be an incredibly strong intervention. And the best rule of thumb is to ensure that the employer, and by employer I mean not just the manager, and not just the supervisor, but the staff, who is going to be working with this person, who is this individual going to be interacting with on a daily basis, are also involved in the process so that the youth and their colleagues can learn together about what will work best. The youth maybe articulate how they learn best and what they might need from an employer in terms of accommodations by the end of a program like Youth of Future, for example. But if the employer and the staff, so this person's future colleagues, are no more knowledgeable about disability and accommodations than they were before the partnership, then it's more challenging to ensure that the employment experience will remain positive and that there will be retention at the end of the partnership. CCRW's Disability Confident Employer Program, or DSEP, is a great resource for employers, and I've linked it in the resources below. And I can highlight that a really creative and effective partnership came out of Alberta, where job coaches were either business or human resources or psychology students, or more mature workers who were close to or just into retirement. And depending on the nature of the work experience of the job seeker, they created a roster of potential job coaches that was really fulsome and full of talent and knowledge. And this allowed for a full circle, full partnership of support and learning for the job seeker, and the employer and the coaches as well, because these individuals were continuously learning as well during this time. And on the next slide, I'd like to read a testimonial that I thought was really brilliant. And it really highlights what a great partnership can look like from the start, from the perspective of how the employer engaged with the job seeker. And I'll read it out. So the manager of the store was very understanding and flexible when it came to the interview. He was not concerned with the typical interview style and met the needs of the participant by asking him questions and showing him around the store. He asked the participant which department he'd be interested in, and the floor supervisor was also very kind and patient. She showed him how to do the job and also allowed him the freedom to work on his own and problem solve. She built a rapport with the participant. I think the difference between this placement and some of the others was that there is an understanding of disability, not to the highest degree, but there was a comfort level with it and a kindness. I think they treated the participant just like any other employee. They didn't act as if they were doing us a favor by taking him on. I think the attitude of the employer makes all the difference. And I think the key here, because a lot of employers, the moment that that they are going to be bringing on a job seeker with a disability, there's a lot of stress and anxiety around that on their part, because they immediately go into, okay, well, what do I need to do? I don't know. How do I do this? And it can be really anxiety inducing. And I think for employers to understand that you don't have to do a deep dive necessarily, but having a general understanding and a kindness around it, a comfort level with it to start is the best starting point that really you could have. So in terms of challenges and sort of opportunities on the next slide, a considerable challenge that we as employment service providers find today is low digital literacy in many of the participants that we serve. So they may have a smartphone, they may know how to post on social media and use apps like WhatsApp, but they don't have a lot of experience necessarily in using Microsoft Office. Of course, participants who have college and university degrees usually have high digital literacy. But for programs like Youth of the Future, we do find that low digital literacy is a barrier to employment, especially for youth who are looking for even entry-level work in administrative positions. We find that from a frontline service provider perspective, training is key, and of course ongoing learning is critical to the work. And we find that training around mental health in our job seekers and addictions is critical, and we always feel like we're catching up. And I did mention employer disability confidence. This is something that will probably be an ongoing conversation, and the only advice that I can give to employers right now in this limited amount of time is just reach out to employment service providers. We can support you in finding accommodations and working with you to have a really great transition to the workforce for the job seeker that you're hiring or that you have already hired. It should come as no surprise for most of this audience that inconsistent transitional supports programming, such as programs like Youth of the Future, to support job seekers and employers, do pose a challenge. In the past, the Youth of the Future program was just a 49-week pop-up program, and then while we were waiting for funding, staff would be on EI or be reprofiled to another program, and then we would start back up again. So there was no consistency, and so even community members didn't really know what was going on. Was our program still running? So it's really difficult to establish and maintain relationships with employers, with community members, and have staff with continuous ongoing training and so on when the programming is so inconsistent. What's great now is that our programming is 3 years in length. Is it long enough? No, but these are improvements. So it's great to know that the funders are listening and that there are improvements in this area. And my final point is really to speak on sort of the stream of employer and employment opportunities for youth. So many employment support programs, such as Youth the Future, engage in job development, which is where staff will work with the job seekers in their job search, and also enhance that support by cold calling on that participant's behalf and really reaching out to local employers based on want ads that we find in local newspapers, online, and so on. It's an incredibly involved process, and a lot of the times, especially when we get a new group of youth, it can feel like reinventing the wheel each time. And my only request and recommendation is that, for employers, if you're looking to hire inclusively, if you're looking to partner with programs like the Youth the Future program and so many others, please feel free, and we welcome you. Please reach out to us and let us know what you're looking for, and we can potentially match you with job seekers who meet the skill sets that you're looking for, and as well provide support with accommodations and smooth that transition into ongoing employment. So that's all I have for employment service provision. There's so much more to discuss, and I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to fielding your questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cailen. Thanks for highlighting how important it is to have that high level of collaboration amongst everyone to address this very multi-layered challenge. So thank you to all the panelists, to Arif, Roxana, and Cailen. I want to summarize the panel discussion with some recommendations that are being put forth. First and foremost, the need for additional research on barriers and facilitators to the school to work transition, especially within the context of a changing labor market. Secondly, the development of a Canada-wide team of disability advocates representing the rights, interests, and well-being of employment-destined young Canadians with disabilities. Thirdly, there needs to be easier access to specialized assessment and disability accommodation funding needed to transition between school to work. And additionally, the need for cross-ministry training around persons with disabilities and links to tools and resources that are needed to support the transition. And finally, we really want to emphasize the need for continued development and expansion of the experiential learning in schools. So those co-ops, those internships that take place for students. So at this point, I would like to open up the floor for any questions that you may have for our three panelists.